We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Aleph Amid Beis and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 71b. On the previous summit, the Mishnah said even though one is not supposed to harvest before the Yomer, but in the irrigated fields there's a leniency, and that is permitted, but it's just permitted to harvest. It is not permitted to stack the grain. And then the Mishnah said the Anshe Yericho, the people of Yericho, they would harvest and they would stack the grain. The harvesting was fine. That was Biritzon Chachamim. It was in accordance with the will of the Chachamim, but the stacking was against the will of the Chachamim. But nevertheless, it said in the Mishnah, Lo Michu Biyadim, the Chachamim did not protest against them. And in the Gemara said that who is the Tana that uses this language of Michu, of protesting, or Lo Michu, not protesting? It's Rebbe Yehuda. And so therefore we can conclude from that Rebbe Yehuda is the author of our Mishnah. But the Gemara then asked, if that is the case, we have a problem from a Brisa, because the Brisa quotes Rebbe Yehuda, and Rebbe Yehuda mentions this Ketzira, mentions the harvesting that the Anshe Yericho did in the irrigated fields, and says that it was Shelo B'Ritzon Chacham, it was not in accordance with the will of the Chachamim, even though our Mishnah says Kotzrin was in accordance with the will of the Chachamim. And the Gemara now is just in the middle of bringing this Brisa. The Brisa here continues and says the following things the Chachamim did protest against, and they were Matir and Gamzios Shel Hektish, Shel Chorov Shel Shikma. The Anshe Yericho permitted branches of Hektish, of the carob trees and of the sycamore trees. Rashi explains Matir and Gamzios Shel Hektish Bahana, they permitted getting benefit from them. And Nofim Shel Chorov V'Shikma, this is talking again about the branches of the carob and the sycamore. Because they said that our fathers only sanctified elakoros, just the beams, ikar ha'ilan, that's the main part of the tree, vionu natir gamzios, and we're saying that the gamzios, the branches, are permitted, v'kasav ein me'ila begidulin, they held that there's no me'ila, there's no liability of misuse by these growths. The reason why we're choosing over here the carob and the sycamores, because those were generally used for beams, and again that the Chachamim protested against. And furthermore, uportzin pirtzos beginoseinu v'pardososein, and they would make openings in their gardens and in their orchards kedei lahachel nesher la'anim, in order to feed of the fallen food to the poor, b'shnei batzoros, in years of famine, b'shabbosos uv'yomim tov, man Shabbos and Yom Tiv. And Rashi explains lahachel nesher, to give to eat the nesher, the fallen produce, peros shetachas ha'ilon. This is the fruit that's underneath of the tree, shenoshru, that fell off. V'rabbanan gazru. Now the reason why this was inappropriate is because the Rabbanan made a gezerah, shemayala v'yislosh. Maybe somebody's going to go up and going to detach it from the tree. And finally, the Brisa concludes, V'nos and Peah Yerik, they would also give Peah, that's the corners of the field, to the poor. With regards to vegetables, they would give that as Peah. Umichu biyadim, and again the Chachamim protested against them. Rashi explains, V'nosnim Peah Yerik, Vein Peah no Heges B'klal, there is no Peah by Yerik. Dechlal Amru B'Peah, there's a general rule by Peah. Kolshu Ochel V'nishmor Umachnisan L'kiyam, anything that is a food and it is protected and it's brought in for preservation. V'amrinan Machnisu L'kiyam L'mu'uta Yerik, and we say Mesechet Shabbos, that excludes yerek vegetables. Now, what's the problem of giving pay? It's just essentially like a tzedakah, like a charity, but the problem is that once it's designated as payah, so now there's no obligation of meiser, and that's not in accordance with the halacha. And in any case, again, the entire point of bringing this brisa is that Rebbe Yehuda over here is saying that it was not in accordance with the will of the Chachamim, and that goes on the Ketzira as well, the harvesting as well in these irrigated fields. And the Gemara continues and answers, but according to your reasoning that you're asking from this Brisa, Shisha, the Brisa says there are 6 things that were not in accordance with the Chachamim, but Shiva have it. But actually, if you look at the Brisa, there were 7 things that were listed, and so therefore there's obviously problems in this Brisa anyhow. And so the Gemara answers, Ella, rather we must say Sami Mikan Katsira, just remove the word Katsira from this Brisa, and that will solve the problem. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Kotzer l'shachas, another leniency in terms of harvesting before the Omer is by shachas. If one harvests for animal fodder, umachil lebehem, and then feeds it to the animal, that is okay. And the Mishnah then goes on to bring a machlokas tanoim with regards to this. Rabbi Yehuda says this is specifically with regards to grain that has not grown 1/3, it has not yet grown to that amount. And Rabbi Shimon says no, even if it has grown to 1/3, but kotzer l'shachas umachil lebehema is still going to be a leniency. And the Gemara says, Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah over there, this is a Mishnah in Meseches Peah, it says, Ve'elu mafsikin lepeah, the following can be a hefsik, it can be an interruption in a field, so to speak, a separation in a field, that now the field is considered to be like 2 fields, and they're separate fields as far as Peah is concerned. That's what it means, mafsikin lepeah. Rashi explains, mafsikin lepeah, lose shte peah, so you now have to give Peah twice, because it's considered to be like 2 separate fields, and they are as follows. Hanacha, let's say there is a stream that cuts through the field, v'hashalulis, or there's a a pond of water. V'derech hayochid, v'derech harabim, if there is a road, a private road or a public road, ushvil harabim, ushvil hayochid hakavua b'mos hacham uv'mos hageshamim, where there's a path for the public or a path for the individual, and that is used in both the summertime and the rainy season, the winter time. V'habor, in an uncultivated field, let's say that's in the middle of the field, that acts as a separation. V'hanir, or let's say you have a plowed field. V'zera acher, let's say you have some other kind of seed, something else that is planted within that field, and that interrupts between the main item which is planted in the field. And the last case in the Mishnah, and this is relevant to our Mishnah, v'kotzer l'shachas, and if one harvests l'shachas, one harvests, but again it's for animal fodder, so in that situation, is that considered to be harvesting the beginning of the harvest of the entire field, or is that not considered a normal harvest, and therefore it would be a hefsek? That's a machlokas tanoim. Mafsek divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says kotzer l'shachas is a hefsek, meaning that is not a normal katsira according to Rabbi Meir. The chachamim omrim, and the chachamim say ein mafsek, it's not considered a hefsek, ela imkein charash, unless it's plowed. Again, as we said, a plowed field is in fact considered to be a hefsek, but kotzer l'shachas would not be considered to be a hefsek. And the understanding of the machlokas tanoim over here is that essentially, according to Rabbi Meir, kotzer l'shachas is not considered to be katsira, and that's really what our Mishnah is saying as well. Kotzer l'shachas is not considered to be katsira, and that's why it's permitted before the Omer. And the Chacham are saying no, kotzer l'shachas is considered to be a regular katsira, and therefore there's no reason that it would be a hefsek. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba bar bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Meir b'shitas Rabbi Shimon Amar. Rabbi Meir over here is following Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah. Again, Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah says, even if it grew a third, still kotzer l'shachas is not considered katsira. The Amar Yiktzor v'yachel, he says one can harvest and give to eat, af mishehevia shlish. He can give to eat to the animals even when it grew a third. In other words, the sheet of Rabbi Meir that kotzer l'shachas is not considered to be katsira, that's true even in a situation where the grain has grown 1/3 of its size. And the Gemara continues, Alma, we see Kasavar that he holds kol l'shachas. Anytime there's harvesting that's done for animal fodder, lav katsira, it's never considered to be katsira. It doesn't matter how much those stalks have grown. And the Gemara continues, Yosef Rabba v'kamar lo lahashmait. The Rabba was sitting and he said over this teaching. And the Gemara says, Eisvei Rav Acha bar Huna l'Rava. Rav Acha bar Huna, he asked Rav a question on this based on the following brisa. Let's say you have a field, ach l'chagav, let's say there's a portion that's eaten by locusts, karsamu nemalim, or it's chewed up by ants, or shavartu aruach, or let's say it's broken by the wind. So there hakol modim, there everybody admits that charash mafsik, only if it's plowed is it considered a hefsik as far as pay is concerned. Lo charash, but if it's not plowed, eino mafsik, it's not considered to be a hefsik. In other words, fundamentally, these cases are not considered to be a hefsik. And the language used over here is hakol modim. Everybody agrees. What do we mean everybody agrees? Hakol modim man. Who's the everyone that agrees? It must be Rabbi Meir. It must be Rabbi Meir because again, Rabbi Meir said in the Mishnah and Peah that we just quoted that kotzer l'shachas is considered to be a hefsik. Even Rabbi Meir, who says kotzer l'shachas is considered to be a hefsik, but these cases are not considered to be a hefsik. And so the Gemara now says, now if you're going to say that our Mishnah is talking about a situation, Rabbi Meir says it's a hefsik only in a situation where it didn't grow a third, and so then brisa de charish in a lo charish lo, then we're going to say that the brisa, what's that talking about? That the brisa says it's not considered a hefsik, it's only a hefsik if it's plowed, if it's not plowed, it's not a hefsik. Why would it not be a hefsik in these cases of achla chagav and karsamun and molim? That would be b'shehev shlish. That would be in a situation where it did grow a third, where it grew a third, so it's more significant. Once it's more significant, that's already going to be considered like a harvest. If it's considered like a harvest, it's not going to be a hefsek. And that would make sense. That only makes sense if Rabbi Meir was talking specifically shelo hevi shlish. But if you're going to say that the Mishnah and Pei is talking in all situations, if one harvests for animal fodder, it's not considered to be a harvest, and therefore it is a hefsek. So now 1 second, hashta now. Umahasam de katsira, if in that case where literally the person actually is harvesting, and we're saying it's not considered to be a harvest, and Amar Rabbi Meir lo shma katsira, Rabbi Meir saying it's not considered to be a harvest in essentially all situations, so in this case, certainly by chagav, by nemolim, it's eaten by animals, certainly hacha over here, lo kol shekain, it certainly should not be considered to be a harvest. Why is it that over here it's considered to be a harvest? It must be that the only reason is because it grew a third, but but again, if we're going to say that Rabbi Meir says his halacha in all situations, even where it grew a third, we do not understand why Rabbi Meir would say over here by Achlach Agov that that's considered to be a harvest. And the Gemara continues, El Rabbi Meir b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda Amra. Rather, we have to say it is incorrect. Rabbi Meir was not following Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir must have been following Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, when Rabbi Meir said that it's not considered to be a harvest and therefore it's a hefsek as far as payah, he was only saying that where it grew a third. Rabbi Yehuda Da'amar, Rabbi Yehuda who says, Eimosai, when is it true? Bisman shehischil ad shelo hevi shlish. We're only lenient and we say it's not a harvest. In our Mishnah, it's a leniency. That's only if it hasn't grown a third. That's if he begins the harvest before it grew a third. Avolim hischil ad shevi shlish. But if he began that after it already grew a third, so then it's forbidden to harvest before the Omer. And so you're going to have to say again that really Rabbi Meir is following Rabbi Yehuda, and again this leniency only applies in a situation where it had not yet grown a third. But the Gemara continues and asks, but 1 second, Eimor de shamat le Rabbi Yehuda lebehema. We can say that Rabbi Yehuda said his halacha in a situation lebehema. In other words, in a situation where the harvest was done and it has not yet grown a third, and it was done for animal food, specifically to be fed to animals, so then Rabbi Yehuda says it's not called a harvest. But la'adam mishamatle, but do we know that Rabbi Yehuda says this even if the food was harvested for people? And the Gemara here is asking this question because in the Mishnah where Rabbi Meir is mentioned, all it says in that Mishnah is v'kotzer l'shachas mafsik, is that if one is kotzer l'shachas, it's mafsik, it's considered to be a hefsik, it's not considered to be a katsira, but that seems to be going even in a situation where it's done for humans. As Rashi explains, Liada Mishamatle, does Rabbi Yehuda say this even in a situation where it's going to be used and given to humans? Diafilu la'adam ki lo hevi shlish. Let's say in a situation la'adam that it's for a person, ki lo hevi shlish, if it didn't yet grow a third, lo to have a katsira, that it's not going to be a katsira. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't go that far, but Rabbi Meir does go that far. If Rabbi Meir afilu bekotzer la'adam, Rabbi Meir says even in a situation of kotzer la'adam, he's harvesting it for a person. Kagon shachas, for example, you have fodder, lekloyos nami yomer. Let's say it would be fodder, but it would be lekloyos, it would be for toasted grain. He would say that there also. To katani kotzer l'shachas mafsik. It says kotzer l'shachas is mafsik. V'lo katani kotzer l'shachas lebehema mafsik. It doesn't say kotzer l'shachas for an animal is mafsik. And so therefore, even if we're going to try to explain that Rabbi Meir is following Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir is saying that kotzer l'shachas is not considered to be a katsira, but Rabbi Yehuda only said that if it's done for animals. He didn't say that if it's done la'adam, if it's done for people. And how do we know that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't go that far? Di'im kain, because otherwise, Rashi explains, the im kain da'af la'adam nami amar Rabbi Yehuda. If Rabbi Yehuda did go that far and said even la'adam it's not considered to be a katsira, that would be problematic because havilahu talosa tanoi. That would actually mean that there's a three-way machlokas tanoim in the Mishnah. The way we're understanding the Mishnah is that the Tanakama who talks about kotzer l'shachas, the Tanakama who says that in such a situation it is permitted, is really just being explained by Rabbi Yehuda. It's not that there's Tanakama, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon. It's that there's two shitas. There's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Now we know clearly that the Tanakama is talking only lebehema. The question is within Rabbi Yehuda. And so therefore, if you're going to say that Rabbi Yehuda is talking even la'adam, so now we have a third shita within this Mishnah. As Rashi explains, Havilu Talasa Tanoi, it's going to be a three-way machlokas tanoim. Why? B'masnis in our Mishnah. Because Tanakama or behedya lebehema. The Tanakama says clearly the leniency of harvesting before the Omer is specifically lebehema for an animal. V'yaz Rabbi Yehuda l'meimer emosai v'zman she'eschel ad shelo hevi shlish. Then Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, Amosai, when is that true if it didn't grow a third? V'yafilu la'adam nami shari. And now we're suggesting maybe he means even la'adam. It's also permitted. That's a second shita. Rabbi Shimon omer af yiksor lechatchila machil la'adam misha hevi shlish. And then Rabbi Shimon would go even further. He would say it can even be for a person even when it grew a third of the way. But imkain also Rabbi Yehuda lachlok. And if that's true, then Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on the Tanakam of the Mishnah. And why is that problematic to suggest? V'kaimalan b'Sanhedrin b'Perek Zeborer. We've established in Sanhedrin in Perek Zeborer, Kol Mokum Shoshana Rabbi Yehuda. Anytime Rabbi Yehuda is in a Mishnah and says Amosai when, Eino Ela Lafarish, he's just explaining the Tanakama, not arguing. Uvameh Lachlok. If the word that's used by Rabbi Yehuda is Bameh, like Bameh Devorim Amurim, then Rabbi Yehuda is arguing. But Amosai is not an argument, and so therefore that's why it's problematic. If the Tanakama specifically says Lebehema, it must be Rabbi Yehuda also means to say Lebehema. And the Gemara continues, Ella rather, Kiyasar Rav Dimi Amar, when Rav Dimi came, he said, Rabbi Meir Beshitas, Rabbi Akiva Rabo Amar, Afli Adam Nami Lo Have Kitzira. Rabbi Meir is actually following the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe. He's not following Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. He's not following Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah. He's following Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, Afli Adam, even for people, if it's harvested for people, it's not considered to be a Kitzira. And Rashi explains, Afli Adam Nami Lo Have Kitzira. Even Li Adam is not Kitzira. Ad shelo hevi shlish, and this would specifically be in a situation where it has not grown 1/3. In that situation where it has not grown 1/3, even if it's liyadam, it's not ketzira. As the Gemara continues, the Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah, Meseches Peah, hamenamer sada v'shayir bo klachim lachim. Let's say a person he takes patches out of the field, he harvests patches from the field, and now there are certain areas where there are klachim lachim, there are stalks that are still moist. They're in separate areas. They're not all contiguous. They're not all connected. Rabbi Akiva Omer Peah l'chol echad v'echad. Rabbi Akiva says we have to treat each patch like its own field, and there has to be separate payah for each one. The Chachamim Omer me'echad ala kol, and the Chachamim say one takes one payah for everything. Rashi explains, Hamenamer kotzer shura, he harvests one row, umeniach shura, he leaves another row. To have a sadr menumor, that's called a sadr menumor. It looks like it has spots, it has patches. Klachim lachim, let's say that he leaves these klachim lachim, meaning to say that they're moist, they haven't fully grown. It's essentially the equivalent of not having grown 1/3. Do you have a godly called sarch, and the point is if they're fully grown, to kuli alma payah achas ala kol, then everybody agrees that it's going to be one payah for everything. To tchilas ktsirahi, because that harvesting that was being done was just the beginning of the regular process of ktsira. Again, the whole issue is dependent upon the fact whether this is all one ktsira. But if it's not fully grown, so then again we have this machlokus in the Mishnah, and Rabbi Akiva says that in that situation they're all considered to be independent, meaning it is not considered to be a ktsira, and the Chachamim say it is considered to be a ktsira. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, and Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, Lo chayiv Rabbi Akiva el b'menamer lekloyos. Rabbi Akiva only says this if one is harvesting lekloyos, that's for toasted grain, avol b'menamer leotzer, but if he's doing it to store it away, lo, then Rabbi Akiva would not say that. Rashi explains, V'yamar Rav Yehuda lekloyos, specifically for toasted grain, meaning, Dahainu dumya deshachas. The point is, again, we're talking where it hasn't grown 1/3, similar to fodder, shelo hevi shlish, that's specifically talking about grain that has not grown 1/3, shekatzru la'adam, that's harvested for a person, to kloyos la'adam ninu, toasted grain is for people, v'afilu hachi l'Rabbi Akiva lo have katsira, and according to Rabbi Akiva, nevertheless, it is not considered harvesting. Again, this is where we see that if it's lo hevia shlish la'adam, it is not considered to be katsira. That's Rabbi Akiva's shita, and that's what Rabbi Meir is saying as well. Liotzer, but if he's doing it to store it, shebishal kol tzarcho, that's just a way of saying that it is totally ripe. Umelaked al manas la'otzro liyashno, he wants to put it in a storehouse, and he wants to age it, so then already it would be different. Then it would be a situation where it's considered like harvesting. But the Gemara continues, Ini, is this really true? V'hakiyasa Ravin amar Rabbi Yochanan, but when Ravin came, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Mechayiv hoyer Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was chayiv payah for each part, af b'menamer la'otzer, even in a situation where he was menamer for otzer. Rashi says, af b'menamer la'otzer, Rabbi Meir b'shehevi shlish, islay diktsirahi. Rabbi Meir holds that once it's hevi shlish, so then already it is considered to be a katsira, and Rabbi Akiva would not be saying that. Rabbi Akiva would be saying even in a situation of hevi shlish, it is not considered to be a katsira according to this understanding. Again, kediktani le'el ach l'chagav, that's what we said earlier by ach l'chagav. Again, according to Rabbi Meir makes a distinction between hevi shlish and lo hevi shlish. That's how we answered that brisa earlier of ach l'chagav, where the locusts eat a portion of the field, and so Rabbi Meir makes that distinction, and apparently Rabbi Akiva does not make that distinction, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Beis Amud Aleph.